A billionaire CEO feared lawsuits. She didn't fear competition. She feared a child's drawing. Ethan Cole had learned how to become invisible. It wasn't something he consciously decided one day. It simply happened after his wife died and the world kept moving without pausing for his grief. In the 3 years since the accident, his life had narrowed into a routine built on survival. Wake up early, get Ava ready for school, pack her lunch with whatever he could stretch from his paycheck. Drop her off with a smile that felt braver than he was. Then report to Laurent Global Tower before the executives even arrived. As a maintenance supervisor, Ethan worked in the background of one of the most powerful buildings in the city. He fixed flickering lights, repaired cracked tiles, adjusted heating systems that executives complained about in passing. No one remembered his name. He preferred it that way. Being invisible meant stability. Stability meant Ava was safe. Laurent Global Tower was a monument to ambition. Glass walls, marble floors, polished steel accents, and the kind of quiet that only expensive buildings could afford. The top floors housed boardrooms where decisions worth millions were made in minutes. The lower levels, where Ethan spent most of his time, smelled faintly of cleaning solution and machine oil. It was there, in a converted storage office near the service elevators, that Ava waited most evenings after school. Childcare was too expensive, and Ethan refused to leave her alone at home. So she sat at a small metal desk beside his tool cabinet. Coloring in worn sketchbooks while he handled work orders, Ava had her mother's soft brown curls and an imagination that seemed too big for the small office walls. She drew constantly. Buildings with faces. Clouds shaped like animals. People standing under oversized suns. Ethan didn't always understand her pictures, but he treasured every one of them. They were proof that something gentle still existed in a life that often felt heavy. On the evening, everything changed. Rain pressed against the skyscraper windows like impatient fingers. A board meeting had been called on short notice. Ethan knew because the executive floor lighting system had to be adjusted twice, and security had asked maintenance to remain on standby. He finished tightening a loose fixture in the hallway just outside the main conference room when raised. Voices echoed through the corridor. Men arguing. Chairs scraping. The kind of tension that didn't belong in polished buildings. He glanced toward his office and saw Ava watching from the doorway. She had wandered farther than usual, curiosity pulling her down the hall. Before he could call her back, the boardroom doors swung open. Several suited men stormed out, their expressions tight and irritated. None of them noticed the little girl standing near the glass wall. At the far end of the now quiet conference room sat a woman. Ethan recognized only from company newsletters and framed portraits in the lobby. Victoria Hale, the CEO. 38, youngest chief executive in company history. The media called her relentless. Investors called her brilliant. Employees called her intimidating. She remained seated while the others left, her posture straight, her face unreadable. But from where Ava stood, something else was visible. Not power, not authority, just stillness. The kind that felt heavy. Ava didn't understand mergers or stock projections. She didn't know about corporate pressure or boardroom politics. She only saw a woman sitting alone in a very large room after everyone else walked away. Ethan stepped forward quickly, guiding Ava back toward the elevators before security noticed. He gave her a gentle reminder about wandering. She nodded, unusually quiet, clutching her sketchbook close to her chest. He assumed the moment had already faded from her mind. The next morning, before Ethan could stop her, Ava slipped away briefly in the lobby. By the time he found her, she was returning from the reception desk, looking satisfied. "I left something," she whispered. He didn't think much of it until later that afternoon, when an email from corporate security summoned him to the executive floor. His stomach tightened. Maintenance staff were rarely called upstairs unless something had gone wrong. When he entered the CEO's office, The view from the floor-to-ceiling windows nearly stole his breath. The entire city stretched beneath them, gray from the lingering rain. Victoria Hale stood near her desk, composed, immaculate, her presence commanding without effort. On the glass tabletop in front of her lay a single sheet of paper. Edges slightly curled, it was Ava's drawing. Ethan recognized it instantly. A tall woman standing atop a skyscraper. The building beneath her cracked down the center. Above, dark clouds parted just enough for a small yellow sun to peek through. Victoria did not raise her voice. She did not look angry. She simply rested her hand lightly against the paper and looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Your child," she said quietly, "drew my collapse." In that moment, Ethan had no idea that a simple crayon drawing was about to expose fractures inside one of the largest corporations in the country, or that his daughter's innocent. Observation would place both of them directly in the path of something far bigger than they were prepared for. Ethan's first instinct was to apologize. Standing in Victoria Hale's office, surrounded by glass walls and a skyline that made him feel even smaller, he felt the weight of invisible lines he had crossed without meaning to. "I'm sorry," he said quickly, his voice rough from nerves and years of speaking softly in hallways where powerful people disliked noise. "She's just a kid. She didn't mean anything by it." He kept his eyes on the drawing, unable to fully meet the gaze of the woman whose decisions shaped the building he worked in. But Victoria did not respond with irritation. She studied him the same way she had studied the crayon lines, as if searching for something beneath the surface. "She meant something," Victoria replied calmly. Her voice carried none of the sharpness the media often attached to it. It was measured, almost reflective. Children rarely draw things they don't feel. She turned the paper slightly toward him. "Tell me what you see." Ethan hesitated. He wasn't used to being asked for opinions, especially not here. "I see a building," he said carefully, "cracking, and someone standing on top of it." He swallowed. "But there's sunlight too." Victoria gave a faint nod. "The building is this company," she said, not as a question, but as a quiet admission. "And the cracks are real." She moved toward the window, looking down at the city below. From behind, she appeared every bit the powerful CEO the world recognized. Tailored suit, posture straight, presence controlled. But when she spoke again, there was something less guarded in her tone. "The board wants me to approve a merger tomorrow morning. On paper, it's brilliant. Short-term stock surge. Aggressive expansion. Investors would celebrate." She paused. "But the cost won't show up immediately." Ethan listened without interrupting. He didn't belong in this conversation. He knew that. Yet something in her voice held him there. Hundreds of small contractors would be squeezed out within the year. She continued. Their margins erased. Their loans called in. Some of them would survive. Many wouldn't. She turned back to him. "Your daughter drew this before I made my decision." A realization crept into Ethan's chest, slow and uneasy. His late wife's family had owned a small construction subcontracting business. It had collapsed years ago after a large corporation acquired their primary client and restructured contracts. The details had always felt distant, like something too complex for him to fully understand. All he remembered was the stress, the endless calls, and the eventual bankruptcy that strained his marriage before illness took her away. He never connected that kind of collapse to the towering building he now cleaned. Victoria walked back to her desk. "I built my reputation on strength," she said, "on never hesitating, on making decisions other people are too afraid to make." Her fingers lightly traced the crayon crack down the center of the skyscraper in the drawing. "But this deal feels different." Ethan finally looked up at her, not at the CEO, at the woman. For the first time, he noticed the exhaustion hidden beneath her composure. "Then don't sign it," he said quietly. surprising himself with the boldness of the suggestion. A faint, almost humorless smile touched her lips. "You say that as if it's simple." "It might not be simple," he replied, steadier now. "But if you already see the cracks, ignoring them won't make them disappear." The room fell into a silence that didn't feel hostile. It felt heavy with possibility. Victoria returned to the window again. "Do you know what collapse means in my world?" she asked. "It means shareholders revolt. It means headlines about instability. It means being replaced." She looked over her shoulder at him. "I have spent my entire career proving I am unbreakable." "And what if being unbreakable is the problem?" Ethan said before he could stop himself. The words lingered between them. Victoria turned fully toward him now. There was no offense in her expression, only consideration. "Your daughter saw something no analyst has pointed out," she said. "Not numbers, not profit. Just isolation." She picked up the drawing and held it carefully. "She drew me alone." Ethan's chest tightened. Ava had lost her mother. She knew what alone looked like. Victoria walked back to her desk and pressed a button on the intercom. "Cancel tomorrow's merger vote," she instructed her assistant calmly. "I'll address the board personally." There was a pause on the other end. "Are you certain?" the assistant asked. "Yes," Victoria said, her voice firm again, but different now. Not cold. Resolved, she ended the call and looked at Ethan once more. "This will not be received well," she said. "There will be consequences." Ethan nodded slowly. "There usually are when you fix something that's broken." For a brief moment. The powerful CEO and the maintenance supervisor stood on equal ground, connected not by status but by a child's unfiltered truth. Neither of them yet understood how severe the backlash would be. Neither realized that the cracks Ava had drawn were about to split open more than a corporate deal. But as Ethan left the executive floor, he sensed something had shifted inside that glass tower. And Victoria, alone again in her office, looked down at the city below and wondered whether collapse might not mean destruction after all, but exposure. By the time Ethan returned to work the next morning, the building felt different. Laurent Global Tower had always carried an undercurrent of urgency. But now there was something sharper in the air, like the moment before a storm breaks. Conversations stopped when he walked past. Assistants who once ignored him now watched him a little too closely. He didn't need anyone to tell him that Victoria Hale had officially canceled the merger vote. News alerts were already lighting up phones across the city. Financial commentators questioned her stability. Investors demanded explanations. And somewhere inside the upper floors of the skyscraper, powerful men were recalculating their next move. Ethan tried to focus on routine. Replace a faulty air vent on the 23rd floor. Reset a tripped circuit breaker near accounting. Keep his head down. But routine couldn't shield him from the shift in tone. Around noon, he was summoned again. This time, not to the CEO's office, but to human resources. The walk upstairs felt longer than usual. The hallway lights he had repaired the night before seemed too bright. The HR manager, polite but distant woman named Karen Whitmore, gestured for him to sit. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Ethan," she began carefully, folding her hands on the desk. "There have been concerns raised regarding your interaction with Ms. Hale." He blinked. "Interaction. It has been suggested that your personal circumstances may have influenced executive decision-making," she said, choosing her words with corporate precision. "Specifically, that you leveraged an emotional appeal through your daughter." The accusation felt surreal. "My daughter left a drawing," he replied quietly. "That's all." Karen nodded. "Nevertheless, perception matters. The board is reviewing internal processes to ensure no inappropriate influence occurred." "Inappropriate," Ethan repeated, heat rising in his chest. "She's 7. Karen avoided his gaze. Until the review concludes, you are being placed on temporary suspension. The word landed heavily. Suspension meant unpaid leave. Unpaid leave meant rent anxiety, grocery calculations, sleepless nights. Ethan thought of Ava sitting at her small desk in the basement office, unaware that her crayon lines had triggered a corporate earthquake. "I didn't ask for any of this," he said, more to himself than to her, of course. Karen replied, already sliding paperwork across the desk. "We simply need time." By the time Ethan stepped back into the lobby, financial news screens were broadcasting Victoria's name in bold headlines. CEO halts major merger amid internal dispute. Laurent Global faces uncertainty. Commentators speculated wildly about her motives. Some praised her caution. Others questioned her judgment. None of them mentioned a child's drawing. Upstairs, Victoria stood at the head of the executive boardroom once more. The same men who had stormed out days earlier now sat stiffly around the polished table. The mood was colder, controlled. One board member leaned forward. "You've destabilized shareholder confidence," he said flatly. "Over what?" "A hypothetical risk." Victoria met his gaze without flinching. "Not hypothetical, documented. The merger would have allowed cost restructuring that disproportionately impacts small contractors. Acceptable losses," another board member muttered. "To you." Victoria replied evenly. "Not to the families attached to those contracts." A third executive adjusted his glasses. "And the maintenance employee?" he asked pointedly. Was he part of this moral awakening? The implication hung thick in the room. Victoria's expression hardened. "Mr. Cole did not influence my decision," she said. "I made it based on data I reviewed personally." But even as she spoke, she understood what they were doing. If they couldn't reverse her choice directly, they would undermine her credibility. Attach her judgment to something emotional, something unstable. By evening, Ethan sat at home at their small kitchen table, paperwork spread out in front of him. Ava colored quietly across from him, unaware of the full situation, but sensitive enough to feel tension. "Did I do something wrong?" she asked softly, without looking up. His heart clenched. He moved his chair closer. "No," he said firmly. "You told the truth in your own way. That's never wrong." "But the building was cracking," she whispered. "Sometimes things crack because they need fixing," he replied. Across town, Victoria sat alone in her penthouse apartment. The city lights reflecting against glass walls. On her dining table lay Ava's drawing. She replayed the board meeting in her mind. The subtle threats. The suggestion that she had grown emotionally compromised. She knew what would come next. Emergency votes. Investor pressure. Possibly an attempt to remove her. She picked up her phone and scrolled through internal reports again. The projected layoffs. The hidden profit incentives for certain board members. The pieces were there. The cracks Ava had drawn were not imaginary. For the first time in years, Victoria felt fear. Not of losing power, but of losing integrity. If she stepped back now to preserve her position, the merger would return under another name. The damage would simply be delayed. Her phone buzzed with another media alert questioning her leadership. Victoria looked once more at the drawing of the woman standing alone on a fractured skyscraper. Then she opened her laptop and began drafting a public statement. If collapse was coming, she would control how it happened, because the real storm wasn't the falling stock price, it was the quiet war unfolding inside the glass tower, and both she and Ethan were now standing directly in its path. The announcement came less than 48 hours after Ethan's suspension. Laurent Global scheduled a live press conference for noon, and every major financial network carried it. Ethan watched from his small living room, the television volume low so Ava wouldn't absorb the anxiety in his chest. He had spent the morning calculating how long their savings would last if the suspension turned permanent. The numbers were not comforting. Still, when Victoria Hale stepped up to the podium on screen, composed and unflinching beneath a flood of camera flashes, something in him steadied. She did not begin with market reassurance or investor language. She began with silence. A long, deliberate pause that forced the room to quiet. 2 days ago, she said evenly, I halted a merger that many believed was financially advantageous. Reporters leaned forward. Pens hovered. I did so because the projected benefits masked structural damage that would not appear on quarterly reports. She gestured to a screen behind her, and slides illuminated with internal projections, contractor losses, job cuts, accelerated debt triggers. She walked the audience through each figure calmly, dismantling the narrative that the deal was harmless. Then, without theatrics, she reached down and lifted a single sheet of paper. Ethan's breath caught. Ava's drawing filled the screen behind her. This, Victoria continued, was given to me by the child of an employee. Murmurs rippled through the press room. She drew what she saw, a building with cracks and a woman standing alone at the top. Victoria's voice did not tremble. The cracks are real. They are not emotional exaggerations. They are structural consequences. She turned slightly toward the board members seated off camera. Leadership is not about protecting an image. It is about preventing collapse before it becomes irreversible. The statement landed like controlled thunder. Within minutes, social media exploded. Some accused her of exploiting a child's drawing for sympathy. Others praised the transparency. Financial analysts began dissecting the slides she presented, questioning why the merger's internal risk assessments had not been made public earlier. The narrative began shifting from instability to investigation. Upstairs in the executive offices, the board convened immediately after the broadcast ended. The mood was no longer simmering. It was openly hostile. You've turned this into a spectacle, one member snapped. You've exposed internal projections. I exposed concealed risks. Victoria corrected calmly. You undermined investor confidence. I protected long-term viability. Another board member leaned forward, eyes cold. And what happens when shareholders demand your removal? Victoria held his gaze. Then they will do so publicly, knowing exactly what they are choosing. What the board had not anticipated was the effect of sunlight. By mid-afternoon, mid-level executives contacted external regulators with concerns about internal communications surrounding the merger. Anonymous emails began circulating among journalists, detailing incentive structures that disproportionately benefited certain board members if the deal passed quickly. The narrative was no longer about a CEO acting emotionally. It was about potential self-interest at the top. Meanwhile, Ethan's phone buzzed repeatedly. Coworkers who had avoided him earlier now sent cautious messages. Did you see the news? Looks like something bigger is going on. Even Karen from HR left a voicemail asking him to remain available for follow-up discussions. Suspension no longer felt certain. The ground beneath the tower was shifting. At home, Ava sat cross-legged on the carpet, watching a replay of the conference. "That's my picture," she whispered, half confused, half proud. Ethan knelt beside her. "Yeah," he said softly. "It is? Is the building still cracking?" she asked. He hesitated, searching for words a child could understand. Sometimes when people see the cracks, they can fix them before it falls. Across the city, Victoria returned to her office as market numbers fluctuated wildly. Short-term losses were undeniable. But so was the growing conversation about corporate accountability. She knew the board would not retreat quietly. Emergency shareholder meetings were already being scheduled. There would likely be a vote on her position within weeks. Yet for the first time since canceling the merger, she felt clarity instead of doubt. The press conference had not been an act of desperation. It had been an assertion of control. If she were to lose her position, it would not be because she hid behind polished statements. It would be because she refused to approve quiet harm. That evening, she sent a brief internal memo reinstating Ethan pending review. The language was formal, but the message was unmistakable. No employee would be penalized for transparency. When Ethan received the call, informing him he could return to work, relief washed over him in waves he hadn't allowed himself to feel. But relief was tempered by awareness. He and his daughter were no longer invisible. Their small act had rippled outward into boardrooms and newsrooms, and inside Laurent Global Tower. The cracks Ava had drawn were no longer hidden beneath polished glass. They were exposed to daylight, where collapse could either be prevented or accelerated. When Ethan walked back into Laurent Global Tower 3 days after the suspension call was reversed, the building felt taller than he remembered. Not physically, but symbolically. The glass exterior reflected a city still buzzing with debate about Victoria Hale's decision, about corporate responsibility, about whether morality belonged in boardrooms at all. He kept his head down as he entered through the staff entrance, unsure what kind of reception awaited him. A few coworkers nodded in cautious acknowledgement. Others avoided eye contact entirely. No one said anything outright, but he could feel it. He was no longer invisible. Upstairs, the atmosphere was even more charged. Shareholder meetings had been scheduled. Emergency reviews were underway. Financial analysts dissected every internal document Victoria had made public. What had begun as backlash was now evolving into scrutiny of the board itself. 2 members had quietly stepped down, citing personal reasons. Rumors swirled about federal interest in certain compensation clauses tied to the halted merger. The cracks Ava had drawn were widening, but not in the direction the board expected. Ethan returned to his maintenance office, and Ava settled into her familiar seat by the small desk. She colored quietly, occasionally glancing at him as if checking whether things were normal again. He smiled at her more often than necessary, trying to reinforce that they were safe. But he understood something now that he hadn't before. Stability was fragile. It could shift overnight. Mid-morning, he received a message requesting his presence on the executive floor. The summons no longer felt like an automatic threat, but it still tightened his chest. When he stepped into Victoria's office, the skyline stretched behind her as always. Yet her posture seemed less rigid than it had weeks ago. Papers were spread across her desk, not in chaos, but in active motion. "Welcome back," she said simply. "Thank you," he replied. She motioned toward a chair, but he remained standing. Old habits were hard to break. "The board has initiated a vote of confidence," she said without preamble. "It will take place in 10 days. He nodded slowly. "Are you going to lose?" A faint smile touched her lips at his directness. "I don't know," she answered honestly. "But the conversation has changed. That matters." She handed him a document. It outlined a new initiative, a contractor protection framework designed to prevent predatory restructuring practices in future deals. Built-in safeguards, transparency requirements, ethical review panels. It was detailed, practical, and far-reaching. "I intend to implement this regardless of the vote outcome," she said. "But I need perspectives from outside the executive floor." Ethan glanced down at the proposal. "You want my opinion?" "I want accountability," she corrected gently. "You understand what happens when small businesses collapse. You've lived it." He hadn't expected acknowledgement of that history. He rarely spoke about his wife's family business anymore. It felt like reopening an old wound. But standing there, looking at tangible policy changes rather than empty promises, he realized this was different. "It's a start," he said carefully. "But policies only work if people believe in them." Victoria met his gaze. "Then help me make them real." The offer was not glamorous. It wasn't a sudden promotion into executive leadership. It was an advisory role on internal facilities and contractor oversight, a bridge between management and the workforce. a voice that could speak without corporate polish. For the first time, Etha saw how collapse could evolve into reconstruction. Outside the tower, public opinion continued to shift. Investigative journalists uncovered email trails suggesting certain board members had downplayed merger risks for personal bonuses. Regulatory agencies announced preliminary reviews. Shareholder sentiment grew divided, but not hostile. Many long-term investors began expressing support for ethical restructuring over aggressive, short-term gains. The narrative was no longer about a CEO who wavered. It was about a system under examination. That evening, Victoria visited the lower floors unannounced. Not for inspection, but conversation. She stopped by Ethan's office where Ava was finishing another drawing. "Can I see?" Victoria asked softly. Ava handed over the page without hesitation. This time, the skyscraper stood tall and whole. Green vines climbed its sides. Windows were bright. And beside the tall woman at the top stood a smaller figure holding her hand. "What's this one?" Victoria asked. "It's when the building doesn't fall," Ava explained, "because someone fixed the cracks." Victoria's expression softened in a way no camera had ever captured. She handed the drawing back carefully. "Thank you," she said, not to Ethan, but to Ava. As night settled over the city, the tower lights glowed steadily against the dark sky. The vote of confidence loomed. The outcome remained uncertain. But something fundamental had shifted within Laurent Global. Collapse was no longer an inevitability hanging overhead. It had become a warning that led to change, and for the first time in years, both the billionaire CEO and the single father understood that standing tall did not mean standing alone. The morning of the vote arrived without ceremony. Yet it carried the quiet weight of consequence that pressed against every glass panel of Laurent Global Tower. The city moved as it always did below. Traffic flowing, headlines refreshing, analysts speculating. But inside the executive boardroom, the air felt still and deliberate. Victoria Hale stood at the head of the long, polished table, not rehearsing a speech, not scanning her notes, simply present. She had spent the last 10 days not campaigning for her position, but refining the contractor protection framework, meeting department heads, answering hard questions from investors, and, most unexpectedly, listening to employees whose names she had never learned before this month. Whatever happened in the vote, she knew the company had already crossed a line it would not uncross. Ethan remained downstairs in the facilities office, resisting the urge to check his phone every few minutes. He had submitted revisions to the oversight proposal the night before, adding clauses that required community impact assessments before any large-scale restructuring. Victoria had incorporated them without hesitation. That alone felt like a quiet victory. Ava sat beside him at the small desk, drawing again, her crayons scattered in familiar chaos. "Is today the big meeting?" she asked. He nodded. She returned to coloring, unburdened by shareholder politics. Certain in a way, adults rarely are that things eventually land where they should. Upstairs, the board members cast their votes electronically, each decision sealed in quiet taps against glass screens. Some faces were unreadable, others tight with calculation. When the final tally appeared, the result was narrower than anyone had predicted. Victoria retained her position as CEO by a slim margin. Not a landslide. Not a triumphant mandate. But enough. The room exhaled collectively. A few directors offered restrained congratulations. Others gathered their papers with polite detachment. Power had shifted, but not disappeared. Accountability now had a foothold at the table. Victoria did not celebrate. She thanked the board for their confidence and immediately outlined the long implementation timeline for the new contractor framework, making it clear that survival was not the endpoint. Action was. The initiative would be announced publicly within 48 hours, accompanied by a voluntary review of executive compensation structures tied to mergers. Transparency, she stated plainly, was no longer negotiable. Some board members shifted uncomfortably, but no one interrupted. The vote had settled that argument. When she left the boardroom, she bypassed the press waiting in the lobby and took the elevator down to the lower floors. Ethan looked up as she entered the facility's office. He didn't need to ask. The slight release in her posture told him everything. "You stayed," he said quietly. "For now," she replied. "But staying means something different than it used to." She handed him a finalized document. The Contractor and Community Protection Charter, officially approved. His suggested clauses were embedded in the core language. It was no longer a proposal. It was policy. "I want you to chair the Oversight Committee," she added. Ethan blinked. "I fix wiring and HVAC systems. You understand structural integrity," she said. "Not just in buildings." The promotion came with a salary increase, benefit security, and a formal voice in executive reviews. Yet what struck him most was not the title. It was the acknowledgement that lived experience carried weight equal to financial modeling. He accepted, not out of ambition, but out of responsibility. News of the vote and the new charter spread quickly. Financial commentators debated whether ethical safeguards would dampen aggressive growth. Some investors applauded the long-term stability strategy. Others warned of slower returns. But the market response was steady, not catastrophic. Confidence, it turned out, could be measured in more than quarterly spikes. Contractors who had once braced for termination clauses received revised agreements guaranteeing phased transitions and fair compensation. Small businesses previously overshadowed by corporate expansion were invited into partnership dialogues rather than acquisition ultimatums. The culture of Laurent Global began shifting in visible, practical ways. That evening, as the sun set behind the skyline, Victoria stood near the window of her office, no longer feeling as though the glass separated her from the world below. Ethan joined her briefly before heading home. Neither spoke for a moment. The tower lights flickered on across the city, not as symbols of dominance, but as markers of presence. Later, in their small apartment, Ava handed Ethan one final drawing. The skyscraper stood tall again, but this time there were many small figures around its base, each holding a piece of scaffolding, each helping to keep it upright. At the top stood the tall woman, no longer alone. Ethan felt a tightness in his chest that had nothing to do with stress, the measure of legacy. Victoria would later realize was never in how high she built, but in how many people could stand securely beneath what she created. And Ethan understood that sometimes the strongest foundations are laid not by those at the top, but by those who refuse to let the structure crack in silence. The tower remained, not untouched by fracture, but strengthened by it. And in that strength lived a new definition of success, one built not on collapse avoided, but on courage chosen. Subscribe to Drew Daily Stories for powerful emotional dramas, billionaire secrets, shocking twists, and unforgettable characters every single day.